I suppose grief shopping wasn't in your budget. The words landed softly, almost politely, but somehow that made them worse. I looked up and found my daughter-in-law Vanessa staring directly at my shoes. Black flats, scuffed around the edges, 10 years old, comfortable. The same shoes I'd worn to church, doctor's appointments, and now, my husband's funeral. A few people standing nearby lowered their eyes. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended me either. Vanessa smiled as if she'd said something harmless. "Oh, don't look at me like that," she continued. "I just figured Harold would have wanted you to dress a little nicer today." Something inside my chest tightened. Not because of the insult. Because Harold's casket was 20 feet away. 20 feet. And somehow she had found a way to make this day about appearances. I looked toward the front of the chapel. Toward the polished oak casket. Toward the man I'd spent 42 years loving. 42 years. And now he was gone. Yet standing here, surrounded by family, I had never felt more alone. "I think your father-in-law would have cared more about kindness than shoes," I said quietly. Vanessa's smile never moved. "Oh, of course." There was a pause. A deliberate pause. The kind designed to humiliate. But not everyone understands social expectations. Several people shifted uncomfortably. She knew exactly what she was doing. The tragedy wasn't that she disrespected me. The tragedy was that she'd been doing it for years. And somehow, I convinced myself to tolerate it. Because family mattered. Because peace mattered. Because Harold always asked me to be patient. Because every time I considered confronting her, I told myself it wasn't worth tearing the family apart. But standing beside my husband's casket, hearing her criticize my shoes, I felt something changing. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something clearer. Because for the first time I wasn't protecting anyone anymore. And Vanessa had no idea what that meant. The service began 10 minutes later. The chapel filled with quiet conversations and forced sympathy. People hugged. People cried. People shared stories. At least that's what most families do. Our family was different. Our family specialized in performance. Especially Vanessa. She sat in the front row beside my son Marcus. Perfect black designer dress. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. Perfect expression of grief. From a distance she looked heartbroken. Close? She looked annoyed. As if Harold's death had interrupted her schedule. I hated myself for thinking that. But grief has a way of stripping away illusions. You stop pretending. You stop excusing. You start seeing people exactly as they are. And what I saw terrified me. Because Harold had been gone only 6 days. 6 days. And already everyone seemed more concerned about what he'd left behind than who he'd been. The minister spoke about kindness. About generosity. About character. About integrity. Every word reminded me of Harold. He had grown up poor. So poor that as a child, he sometimes skipped meals so his younger sisters could eat. He never forgot that. Even after he became successful. Even after money stopped being a problem. He never became arrogant. Never. That's why people loved him. It wasn't his success. It was his humility. His dignity. His respect for ordinary people. Especially people others overlooked. The janitor. The waitress. The mechanic. The elderly cashier moving a little slower than everyone else. Harold saw people. Really saw them. And maybe that's why losing him felt like losing the last truly safe place in my life. I sat quietly through the service. Listening. Remembering. Trying not to break apart. Then came the reception. And that's when things got worse. Much worse. The church hall buzzed with conversations. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. People gathered in small groups. Sharing memories. Offering condolences. Pretending everything was normal. I stood near a table filled with photographs. Pictures from our wedding. Family vacations. Christmas mornings. 42 years of memories frozen in frames. I was looking at one photograph from 1989 when Vanessa appeared beside me again. "That's such a sweet picture." I nodded. It was Harold holding our son on his shoulders. Marcus couldn't have been older than 6. He was a wonderful father. Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Yes." Another pause. Then she lowered her voice. although I imagine he worried about what would happen after he passed. I turned slowly. What do you mean? Oh, nothing. Her smile returned. That smile. The one that always appeared before something cruel. I just mean finances can be difficult for widows. There it was. Not grief. Money. Again. Always money. I'll manage. Oh, I'm sure. The pity in her voice was unbearable. You know, Marcus and I have discussed helping you downsize. I stared at her. Downsize. The house is huge. It's paid for. Exactly. She laughed lightly. As an asset. I felt my stomach drop, because suddenly I understood. This wasn't concern. This wasn't compassion. This wasn't family. This was inventory. She wasn't looking at my future. She was evaluating property. And somehow that realization hurt more than any insult she'd ever made. Before I could respond, Marcus approached. My son. The little boy from the photograph. The boy Harold adored. The boy I spent 18 years raising. The boy who should have said something. Anything. Instead he asked, "Everything okay?" Vanessa answered before I could. We were just talking about practical matters. Marcus nodded. Practical matters. At his father's funeral. I looked at him carefully. Waiting. Waiting for him to notice my expression. Waiting for him to hear the disrespect hidden beneath her words. Waiting for him to be my son. But he simply placed an arm around Vanessa and said, "Mom, we just want to make sure you're taken care of." The words sounded loving, yet something felt deeply wrong. Because neither of them had asked what I wanted. They had only discussed what they thought should happen. And there is a difference. A very important difference. The conversation ended when another guest approached. But the damage remained. Like a crack spreading quietly through glass. Small at first. Invisible from a distance, until suddenly the whole thing shatters. Over the next several days, the behavior continued. Subtle, polite, constant. Vanessa called 3 times to discuss selling the house, twice to discuss retirement communities, once to discuss my finances. She asked questions no grieving widow should have to answer. Questions about accounts, investments, insurance, property. Every conversation felt less like family and more like an audit. What bothered me most wasn't her curiosity. It was her confidence. She spoke as though decisions had already been made. As though my life belonged to a committee. As though I were incapable of managing my own affairs. And every time she did it, I heard the same message underneath. Poor Margaret. Confused Margaret. Old Margaret. Helpless Margaret. The woman with cheap shoes. The woman who needs guidance. The woman who should be grateful. What Vanessa never understood was that people often mistake silence for weakness. Those are not the same thing. Not even close. One evening, 3 days after the funeral, I sat alone on the back porch. The house was quiet. Painfully quiet. No television. No laughter. No Harold. Just silence. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stared into the darkness. That's when I remembered something. A conversation from nearly a year earlier. Harold and I had been sitting in these exact chairs, watching the sunset, talking about family, specifically Marcus. Harold had been unusually thoughtful that night. What is it? I'd asked. He took a long breath. I worry about something. What? Character. The answer surprised me. Marcus. He nodded. Not completely. But. He hesitated. And Harold almost never hesitated. People become who they spend time with. I knew who he meant. Vanessa. Neither of us said her name. We didn't have to. Maybe you're being too hard on her, I said. Harold smiled sadly. Maybe. But he didn't sound convinced. Then he said something that returned to me now with startling clarity. Real wealth doesn't reveal who you are. He looked toward the horizon. It reveals who you were all along. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I did. Because the moment Harold died, masks began slipping. And what lay beneath wasn't pretty. The next morning brought another surprise. Marcus arrived unannounced. Alone. For a brief moment I felt hopeful. Maybe he wanted to spend time together. Maybe he wanted to talk about his father. Maybe he missed him too. Instead, he placed several papers on the kitchen table. real estate documents. My heart sank. Marcus. Mom, just hear me out. I stared at the papers, then at my son, then back at the papers. The symbolism felt almost cruel. Harold hadn't even been buried a full week, and already we were discussing property. I don't want to sell. You're being emotional. The words hit harder than he realized. Because grief is emotional, loss is emotional, love is emotional. Only people disconnected from humanity use that word as criticism. I'm allowed to be emotional, I said quietly. My husband just died. Marcus rubbed his forehead. For a second he looked genuinely uncomfortable. But then he said something that changed everything. Something I would never forget. Vanessa thinks you're struggling to accept reality. Vanessa thinks. Not Marcus thinks. Vanessa thinks. I looked at him carefully. And suddenly I saw what Harold had seen. The gradual shift. The quiet surrender. The way my son had begun outsourcing his judgment. His confidence. His decisions. His perspective. Piece by piece. Year by year. Until eventually he couldn't distinguish his thoughts from hers. And that realization broke my heart. Because losing Harold was one kind of grief. Losing my son while he was still alive was another. After Marcus left, I sat alone for nearly an hour. Thinking. Remembering. Connecting dots I'd ignored for years. The insults. The condescension. The assumptions. The fake concern. The obsession with status. The endless references to money. The constant reminders that Vanessa believed some people mattered more than others. And perhaps the saddest part? She genuinely thought that made her classy. But real class never humiliates. Real class never mocks. Real class never measures human value through possessions. Harold understood that. I understood that. Vanessa never would. At least that's what I believed then. What I didn't know was that the biggest humiliation was still coming. 3 days later, the family gathered at Harold's attorney's office. The official reading of the will. The atmosphere felt strange from the moment I arrived. Too much anticipation. Too much excitement. Too many carefully hidden expectations. Vanessa was dressed as though she were attending a business merger. Marcus looked nervous. Several extended family members had also appeared unexpectedly. Interesting. Very interesting. Because none of them had shown much interest in Harold while he was alive. Yet somehow they had all found time for the will reading. Funny how that works. I took a seat near the end of the conference table. Quiet. Observing. Listening. The lawyer hadn't arrived yet. People chatted politely. But beneath every conversation was the same question. Who gets what? I hated it. Absolutely hated it. Because the man who spent his life helping others had been reduced to an estate. Numbers. Assets. Possessions. And then Vanessa leaned toward one of her cousins. Not quietly enough. Well, she whispered, glancing briefly in my direction. At least we'll finally know how much damage sentimentality can do. The cousin laughed. A short, nervous laugh. Vanessa smiled. And in that moment, surrounded by polished wood, expensive perfume, and carefully hidden greed, I realized something. She still thought she understood the game. She still believed she knew exactly who I was. The widow in cheap shoes. The grieving woman clinging to memories. The old woman she could manage. Control. Pressure. Guide. She had absolutely no idea what Harold had spent the last 2 years quietly preparing. And as the conference room door slowly opened, as the attorney stepped inside carrying a thick leather folder, as every conversation instantly stopped, the first crack appeared in Vanessa's confidence. She didn't notice it yet, but I did. And for the first time since Harold died, I felt completely calm. Because some truths don't arrive with noise. They arrive with paperwork. And what was inside that folder was about to change everything. The conference room became so quiet that I could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere behind us. The attorney, Mr. Whitmore, walked to the head of the table carrying the thick leather folder. He was a serious man. Precise. Never dramatic. Which made what happened next even more surprising. Because when his eyes met mine, he gave a small nod. Not to Marcus. Not to Vanessa. To me. And something shifted inside the room. Vanessa noticed it too. I saw the brief flicker of confusion cross her face. Only a second. Then it disappeared. Mr. Whitmore sat down and folded his hands. Thank you all for coming. The formalities began. Harold's full legal name, the date of the will, witness confirmations, standard procedure. Yet tension seemed to grow with every sentence. Several relatives leaned forward. Marcus stared at the folder. Vanessa looked almost eager, like a woman waiting for a prize. The sight made my stomach turn, not because of the money, because Harold deserved better. He deserved to be remembered for his character. Instead, people were measuring his life through inheritance. Mr. Whitmore opened the folder. The first section contains several personal statements left by Mr. Harold Bennett. A few people exchanged glances. Personal statements? That wasn't what they came for. But Harold was always thoughtful, always intentional, even from beyond the grave. The attorney adjusted his glasses, then began reading. To my family, if you are hearing this, it means I am no longer with you. If so, I hope you spend more time loving each other than fighting over what I've left behind. A painful silence settled across the room. I felt tears sting my eyes, because I could hear Harold's voice. Every word sounded exactly like him. Money is useful. Property is useful. But neither has ever impressed me. Character impresses me. Integrity impresses me. Kindness impresses me. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then came a line that seemed to hang in the air, especially when kindness costs something. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Just slightly, but I noticed. Mr. Whitmore continued. If anyone is disappointed by the decisions I've made, I encourage them to ask themselves whether they are mourning me, or mourning what they hope to receive. The room became even quieter. A few faces reddened. One cousin looked down at the table, and for the first time, Vanessa's confidence seemed less certain. The attorney turned a page. Now we will proceed to the estate distribution. There it was. The moment everyone had been waiting for. You could practically feel people holding their breath. The first items were simple. Charitable donations, scholarship funds, several local organizations, a children's literacy program, a veterans assistance fund, the food bank Harold had quietly supported for years. Thousands upon thousands of dollars directed toward people most of the family had never thought about. Exactly the kind of thing Harold would do. Vanessa's expression tightened. I could almost see her calculating. Every donation meant less money elsewhere. Less money for her. The realization clearly bothered her. Then came the family allocations. A few relatives received modest amounts. Nothing extravagant. Enough to honor relationships. Nothing more. Some looked disappointed. Others embarrassed. But nobody said a word. Mr. Whitmore finally reached Marcus's section. My son, Marcus Bennett, shall receive the investment portfolio held under account. Marcus sat straighter. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. The number was substantial. Very substantial. Several people looked impressed. Vanessa's smile returned immediately. There it is, I thought. Relief. Validation. Greed disguised as gratitude. Marcus thanked the attorney quietly. Vanessa practically glowed. And for a moment she looked victorious. Then Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. I am not finished. The smile froze. Completely. The attorney continued reading. The investment portfolio shall remain under trustee supervision for 5 years. Vanessa blinked. Marcus frowned. The room stirred. Trustee supervision? Why? Mr. Whitmore continued. Distributions may occur only upon approval by the trustee. The confusion deepened. Then came the next line. The designated trustee is Margaret Bennett. Silence. Absolute silence. Vanessa's entire face changed. Not dramatically. Not immediately. But enough. Like someone realizing the floor beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. Marcus looked stunned. Mom? I didn't answer. Mr. Whitmore kept reading. The trustee shall possess sole authority regarding access, timing, and release of all funds. Vanessa stared at me. Actually stared. As though seeing me for the first time. Not the widow. Not the woman in cheap shoes. Not the person she'd spent years dismissing. Something else. Something she hadn't expected. And we were only getting started. The attorney turned another page. My primary residence shall not be sold, transferred, mortgaged, or otherwise liquidated, without the express written consent of Margaret Bennett. Vanessa's lips parted slightly. The house she'd been discussing before Harold was even buried. The house she'd already mentally converted into cash. Untouchable, at least without my approval. I saw panic flash across her face. Brief, but unmistakable. Then came the real surprise. The one nobody expected. Not even me. Mr. Whitmore removed a separate envelope from the folder. Mr. Bennett instructed me to read this section personally. The room froze. My heart began pounding. Because Harold had never mentioned this. Not once. The attorney unfolded the letter. Then began reading. Many people assume Margaret depends on me financially. Vanessa went completely still. So still it was almost frightening. The attorney continued. They are mistaken. A strange sensation moved through the room. Confusion. Curiosity. Concern. 30 years ago, Margaret helped build several business ventures alongside me. Although she preferred privacy and received little public recognition, much of our success came from her judgment. I felt tears gathering again. Not because of the money, because Harold remembered. He remembered everything. The late nights, the sacrifices, the years spent working together, the decisions we made as partners, things nobody else had ever noticed. The attorney continued. Many people see my accomplishments. Few understand how many of those accomplishments were actually ours. The room remained silent. Completely silent. Vanessa looked physically uncomfortable now. The confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Then came the revelation. The one that changed everything. 22 years ago, Margaret became the majority owner of Bennett Family Holdings. For a moment nobody reacted. As if the words required processing. Then reality hit. Hard. Several relatives gasped. Marcus looked confused. Vanessa looked terrified. Actually terrified. The attorney continued. Through various trusts and ownership structures, Margaret currently controls approximately 68% of all company holdings. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself seemed frozen. Because the assumption everyone had shared, the assumption Vanessa had built her entire attitude around, was wrong. Wildly wrong. I had never depended on Harold. We had built everything together. And legally, much of it had always been mine. Vanessa's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. 4 years she had treated me like an aging widow surviving on sentiment and luck. Now she was discovering something else entirely. The woman she'd mocked, the woman she'd pitted, the woman she'd dismissed, was the most powerful person in the room, and the realization was crushing her. Mr. Whitmore wasn't finished. Not even close. The trustee authority granted to Margaret includes final oversight of all family distributions. Another blow. Then another. Then another. Every paragraph seemed to strip away another layer of Vanessa's certainty, until finally there was nothing left. Only embarrassment. Only shock. Only reality. Marcus looked at me as though he'd never truly known me. Perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps none of them had. Because quiet people are often misunderstood. People assume visibility equals importance. Doesn't. The loudest person in a room is rarely the strongest. The strongest person usually doesn't need to announce it. The reading concluded 30 minutes later. Nobody rushed toward me afterward. Nobody offered advice. Nobody discussed downsizing. Funny how quickly people stop giving instructions when they discover you're actually in charge. Vanessa remained seated, staring at the table. The same woman who mocked my shoes now seemed unable to make eye contact. Eventually she stood. Slowly. Awkwardly. Then approached me. The room watched. Every person. Every relative. Every observer. Waiting. Vanessa cleared her throat. I didn't realize. The words sounded small. Very small. I looked at her calmly. What exactly didn't you realize? Her face reddened. The question forced honesty. And honesty was something she'd spent years avoiding. I didn't realize how involved you were. No. I nodded gently. You didn't realize who I was. The room became silent again. Vanessa looked away. I continued. Still calm. Still composed. No one ever hid anything from you. Her eyes returned to mine. Harold never bragged. I never bragged. We simply lived our lives. I paused, then added the truth she'd needed to hear for years. Real wealth doesn't need witnesses. The words hit harder than shouting ever could, because they weren't cruel. They were accurate. And accuracy is often the sharpest weapon. Vanessa swallowed. Hard. I was trying to help. No. The answer came immediately. You were trying to manage someone you believed was beneath you. The pain on her face was immediate. But it wasn't unfair. It was earned. Years of assumptions. Years of disrespect. Years of hidden contempt. All exposed beneath a single moment of truth. Then Marcus spoke. Mom. His voice cracked. For the first time since Harold died, I saw genuine emotion. Not performance. Not obligation. Emotion. I didn't know. I believed him. That was the tragedy. Marcus hadn't known. Because he'd stopped paying attention. He'd allowed someone else's judgment to replace his own. And that failure hurt him now. Deeply. I placed a hand on his arm. That's the problem. His eyes filled with tears. You stopped asking. The words devastated him. Because he knew they were true. Over the following weeks, consequences unfolded naturally. Not dramatically. Not vindicatively. Naturally. Several relatives who had appeared only for the inheritance disappeared again. Interesting. Very interesting. Vanessa became unusually quiet. The arrogance faded. The superiority vanished. For perhaps the first time in her life, she was confronting herself. And self-awareness can be uncomfortable, especially when you've spent years judging others. Marcus began visiting regularly. Alone. Sometimes we'd talk about Harold. Sometimes we'd sit in silence. Sometimes he'd ask questions. Questions he should have asked years earlier. About the business. About our marriage. About sacrifice. About dignity. About character. About real wealth. One afternoon he looked around the kitchen and asked, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" I smiled. Tell them what? Who you were. The question lingered between us. Then I answered. Because the people who matter don't require proof. Marcus lowered his eyes. Another lesson. Another truth. Months later, I received an unexpected visit. Vanessa. She stood on my porch holding a pie. Of all things, a pie. She looked nervous. Genuinely nervous. I invited her inside. We sat at the same kitchen table where she'd once planned my future without permission. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. For several minutes she said nothing. Then finally she spoke. I owe you an apology. I listened quietly. No rescue. No interruption. No easing her discomfort. Some lessons require space. I judged you. She stared at her hands. I judged everything. The honesty surprised me. She continued. I thought success looked a certain way. I waited. Then came the hardest admission. I thought expensive things meant important people. There it was. The wound beneath the arrogance. Not confidence. Insecurity. Not superiority. Fear. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of not mattering. The same fear that drives so much cruelty. I nodded slowly. And now? Tears gathered in her eyes. Now I think I was chasing respect from people who didn't deserve that much power over me. For the first time I saw genuine growth. Not perfection. Growth. And there is a difference. We talked for nearly 2 hours. About Harold. About family. About mistakes. About pride. About dignity. When she left, neither of us was completely healed. But healing had begun. Sometimes that's enough. A year later life felt different. Not easier. Different. Grief still visited. Sometimes unexpectedly. A song. A photograph. An empty chair. Love leaves echoes. It always does. But alongside grief came peace. The kind Harold always valued. The kind that doesn't depend on money. Or status. Or approval. One afternoon I sat on the back porch watching the sunset. The same porch where Harold and I once talked about character. The same porch where I'd cried after the funeral. The same porch where everything had changed. An elderly neighbor named Mrs. Ellis stopped by. She was 83. Sharp as ever. She sat beside me and smiled. You seem lighter. I considered that, then nodded. I am. She looked toward the horizon. You finally stopped carrying people who refuse to carry themselves. The wisdom of ordinary people never ceases to amaze me. As she was right. I had spent years protecting peace by accepting disrespect. Years confusing silence with responsibility. Years tolerating behavior that should have been challenged. Not anymore. Peace isn't surrender. Dignity isn't weakness. And respect should never require wealth. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, I thought about Harold. About his kindness. About his wisdom. About his final gift. Not the money. Not the businesses. Not the inheritance. The truth. He had given everyone the same opportunity to reveal who they really were. Some passed. Some failed. But all were exposed. And maybe that was his greatest lesson. Real wealth isn't what's in your accounts. It's what's in your character when nobody thinks you're important. And real class never laughs at someone else's shoes. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were sitting in that room during the will reading? Do you think Vanessa deserved forgiveness? And have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged you too quickly? Let me know in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from today. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, share it with someone who appreciates stories about dignity and quiet strength, and stay with us for more unforgettable journeys. Until next time, remember this. The people who truly matter will never need proof of your worth. And the people who demand proof were never qualified to judge it in the first place.